Jake Mitchell had lived his entire life by a simple creed. Live and let live, a philosophy that suited the sprawling farm that had been in his family for generations, a place that was more than just a source of income. It was a legacy etched into the soil by the sweat and grit of his ancestors, where every sunrise brought the sight of golden fields, the smell of fresh earth, and the comforting chorus of his animals, a harmony that gave him all the peace he could ever want. That peace, however, was about to be upended by a force more relentless than any drought or storm he'd ever faced. Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association in Crestwood Estates, a suburban development that had sprouted up 5 years ago on the edge of his property. A woman whose inflated sense of authority and obsession with order made her a walking caricature of suburban tyranny. Karen had already earned a reputation for enforcing rules no one recalled agreeing to, her latest target being Jake's farm, which sat just beyond the HOA's official reach. Its barns, animals, and unpaved driveway an affront to her vision of manicured perfection, a vision she was determined to impose whether he liked it or not. The first time she showed up, she strode onto his property with the air of someone personally insulted, dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit, clipboard clutched like a shield, her heels clicking against the dirt as she marched up to his porch where Jake sat sipping his morning coffee, watching her approach with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume." She began, her tone sharp and rehearsed, like a saleswoman about to pitch something he'd never buy, and Jake, taking a slow sip, leaned back in his chair and nodded. "That's me," prompting her to launch into her introduction. Karen Whitmore, president of the Crestwood Estates HOA, here to discuss his property, her tight smile barely masking her disdain as she explained that while his farm wasn't technically under their jurisdiction, its proximity affected their community's delicate property values. She rattled off complaints, noise, smells, the visual impact of his farm clashing with their aesthetic standards, suggesting adjustments like repainting his iconic red barn a more neutral color or downsizing it entirely. And then there was the rooster waking residents before sunrise, a disruption she deemed unacceptable, her words dripping with the confidence of someone used to getting her way through sheer persistence. Jake let out a short laugh, rubbing his chin as he processed her demands. Change the barn's color, silence a rooster, all because her suburbanites couldn't handle a taste of rural life. And when he asked if she was serious, her smile stiffened, her eyes flashing with impatience as she insisted it was in everyone's best interest, a veiled threat lurking beneath her polished demeanor. Standing up, Jake stretched and cut her off. "Miss Whitmore, I appreciate the visit, but my farm's not part of your HOA. I don't follow your rules and my land." Not hurting anyone, his voice firm but calm, while Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her parting shot. "We'll see about that." Hanging in the air as she spun on her heel and stormed back to her SUV, leaving Jake shaking his head, knowing he'd just met a problem unlike any stubborn mule he'd ever dealt with. The trouble started almost immediately after Karen's first visit, a barrage of formal letters on HOA letterhead landing in Jake's mailbox, each one demanding compliance with neighborhood standards despite his farm sitting firmly outside their jurisdiction, their tone growing more insistent with every envelope, as if paper alone could bend him to their will. Then came the phone calls to the county, complaints about supposed code violations, noise from the animals, smells wafting over the invisible line, even the audacity of his barn's existence. All baseless, but persistent enough that Jake couldn't just ignore them, though he tried, brushing them off as the petty tantrums of a woman with too much time and too little sense, until Karen showed up again, this time flanked by 2 HOA board members, their matching expressions of self-importance making them look like a trio of puffed-up pigeons. "You again?" Jake muttered, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped away from fixing a fence, and Karen, with an exaggerated sigh, greeted him like this was some tiresome formality she was forced to endure, handing him yet another document outlining HOA regulations he wasn't bound by, her voice tightening as she repeated her spiel about properties within visual range needing to match Crestwood's aesthetic guidelines, a rule she'd clearly invented on the spot. Jake waved the paper back at her, cutting in, "I'm not in your HOA." But she pressed on, undeterred, warning of further action if he didn't comply, while one of her lackeys, a wiry man with thick-rimmed glasses, chimed in about contacting county officials over zoning laws, hinting at fines if Jake's farm was found lacking, a threat that wiped the amusement off his face, though he knew his land was zoned perfectly for agriculture. "You go ahead and do what you have to," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady. "But if you or your people set foot on my land again, I'll call the sheriff for trespassing." And Corinne's mask slipped for a moment, a flicker of frustration breaking through before she regained her composure, snapping that he was making this harder than it needed to be, to which Jake replied, "No, I think you are," before turning his back and walking away, leaving her fuming as she stormed off with her cronies in tow. That should have been the end of it, but Corinne wasn't one to take no for an answer, and the next escalation came in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped into his mailbox under cover of darkness, which Jake found the next morning, the HOA logo smirking from the corner as he tore it open, revealing a list of absurd violations. The red barn clashing with neighborhood aesthetics, the rooster crowing before 8 a.m., unauthorized livestock like his goats and chickens, culminating in a demand to cease all non-compliant activities within 7 days or face legal action. Laughing so hard he nearly spilled his coffee, Jake tacked the letter to his fridge like a badge of honor, marveling at their gall, knowing they had no legal ground to stand on. But the fact that they'd put it in writing told him Corinne was digging in for a fight, a war she'd declared without realizing he wasn't the type to back down, setting the stage for a battle that was only just beginning. Corinne's next move came swiftly, a wave of county inspectors descending on Jake's farm like flies to a picnic, each visit sparked by anonymous complaints. Health hazards, zoning issues, animal welfare concerns, all clearly orchestrated by the HOA's relentless president, though none held water, leaving the officials baffled and Jake increasingly irritated by the charade. The health department's Roger, a grizzled older man, scanned the pristine animal pens and sighed. "Son, I don't know who you've pissed off, but they've got us running in circles. This is the cleanest farm I've seen in months." And when Jake grinned, suggesting it might be a certain HOA figurehead, Roger only smirked off-record, confirming her name on every report before grumbling about entitled busybodies as he left, a sentiment echoed by the zoning and welfare folks who found nothing amiss, their clipboards as empty as their excuses. But Corinne wasn't deterred, her pettiness escalating with handwritten notes stuffed into Jake's mailbox, unsigned, of course, but dripping with her signature passive-aggressive venom. Pleased to mow his fields for respect, claims his farm's smell tanked property values, even an absurd demand to fence off animals because they distressed suburban kids, each one more ridiculous than the last, pushing Jake from amusement to grudging admiration for her sheer tenacity. Then came the day he heard a chainsaw roaring near the property line, not from his side but Crestwood's, and dropping his tools, he strode over to find HOA-hired workers erecting an ugly steel-gray fence on his land, slicing through his boundary to block the farm's view, supervised by none other than Corinne, clipboard in hand, her smug nod confirming this was her latest gambit. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jake demanded, voice like steel, and Corinne turned with feigned surprise, cooing about community improvements to protect Crestwood's visual harmony, her smile unwavering as she claimed the fence's placement was debatable, citing old survey maps that supposedly redrew the property lines in her favor, a blatant lie that made Jake's fists clench, his calm fraying as he repeated her words. "You believe the property lines were incorrect?" She nodded smoothly, insisting they'd proceed until clarified. But when Jake asked the workers for a permit, their hesitation and muttered reliance on HOA assurances gave him the upper hand, his smirk widening as he warned, "They don't have it, and if you're not gone in 5 minutes, you're trespassing. I'll let the sheriff sort you out." That spooked them. The chainsaw fell silent, tools were gathered, and despite Corinne's livid protests that he couldn't stop a community decision, Jake dialed the sheriff in full view, prompting her to pale and order a retreat, the half-built fence abandoned as she stormed off, her glare promising this wasn't over. That night, Jake didn't just sit back. He dug out his property deed, made copies of the surveyor's map, and sent a formal cease-and-desist letter to the HOA board, warning of trespassing charges if they tried again, a preemptive strike that bought him a few days of quiet, until he woke one morning to find a massive, "For sale" sign staked on his land near the road, paired with another reading under negotiation, coming soon to Crestwood Estates. A bold move that nearly made him admire Corinne's audacity, though fury quickly overtook him as he ripped it out, ready to confront the woman who seemed hell-bent on stealing his legacy one petty stunt at a time. Furious, Jake stormed back to his porch with the uprooted "For Sale" sign, its audacious lie. His farm suddenly on the market, still burning in his mind, and before he could even dial the HOA, Corinne appeared, her SUV squealing to a stop as she stepped out with a chirpy, "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell." Her feigned innocence as flimsy as her excuse that a realtor had prematurely placed it due to a misunderstanding about Crestwood's expansion plans, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed glee. "You're telling me a real estate agency just accidentally stuck this on my land?" Jake shot back, folding his arms, and when her smile faltered, she sighed dramatically, insisting it was all for the community's benefit. A line so rehearsed it sounded hollow even to her, but Jake cut her off, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate edge. "Here! What's happening? You're calling whoever did this and telling them to stay off my property or the next sign I see. I'm not tearing it down. I'm suing your whole HOA for fraud." Corinne paled, her lips thinning as she huffed and spun away, but Jake knew she wasn't done. Her relentless nature wouldn't let her quit, though neither would his resolve, a standoff brewing that was about to get uglier, and he decided it was time to stop playing defense. He headed to the county records office, pulling every document tied to his farm, deeds, zoning approvals, permits, arming himself with legal proof to shove in Corinne's face the next time she overstepped, a stack of papers that felt like a shield against her nonsense. And then he called Sheriff Tom Caldwell, an old family friend, laying out the saga from the fence to the fake sale, prompting a stunned, "She tried that." From Tom, who promised to step in if she trespassed again, a backup plan that gave Jake some breathing room. With that squared away, Jake flipped the script, turning Corinne's petty war into his own game. First, her rooster complaints got an answer in the form of 3 new birds, their 5 a.m. crowing a legal but deafening chorus aimed straight at Crestwood, a middle finger in feathers that had him grinning as he sipped his coffee. Then he tackled her eyesore gripes by planting a field of towering sunflowers along the property line, their bright yellow heads blocking her pristine view with a wall of nature she couldn't touch. A move as practical as it was spiteful. But the real coup was roping in the town. His buddy Mason from the farmers' market suggested a weekly farmers' fun day on Jake's land, a fully legal event with free entry, animals to pet, fresh produce, and live music. And when the flyers went up, the turnout stunned even Jake. Dozens of families flooded in, kids chasing goats, adults snapping up eggs, the air thick with laughter and country tunes, a chaotic delight that drew Corinne like a moth to a flame, her clipboard waving as she screeched. "This is unacceptable." Jake, arms crossed, grinned wider. "Oh, but I can. County says it's fine and people love it, might make it weekly, maybe a full market." Watching her twitch with impotent rage as she stormed off, muttering about the board, her power slipping while his grew, the event a masterstroke that turned her vendetta into his victory. Though he knew she'd retaliate, Corinne didn't lose quietly, and he was ready to meet her next dirty trick head-on. Corinne's retaliation came fast and sneaky, a shift from bold stunts to shadowy tactics that had Jake on edge. Strange cars started lingering near his road at odd hours, their tinted windows and slow crawls raising his hackles, though he brushed them off as nosy HOA drones until he spotted an actual drone buzzing over his fields, its whirring blades a clear sign she'd upped the ante, and when he caught a private investigator snapping photos just beyond his fence. Red-handed and stammering about a property dispute, Jake's patience snapped, barking, "Check from a distance. This is private land," sending the guy scurrying as he realized Corinne had hired a snoop to dig up dirt. That evening, another HOA letter arrived, this time alleging unsanitary animal conditions and zoning infractions, a fresh pile of lies that pushed Jake past irritation into action. He called his lawyer, drafted a full cease and desist order, and marched uninvited into the next HOA board meeting, a room full of gasps greeting him as he strode to the front, dropping a stack of legal papers on the table with a thud that silenced Corinne mid-lecture about community standards. Her face reddening as he laid out her crimes: harassment, trespassing, false complaints, and now illegal surveillance, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. You've been sending spies, and this stops now, or I sue the HOA and you personally for everything you've got. Security footage of the pie and his legal notice backed every word, leaving the room frozen, a few board members squirming as Karen sputtered. That's ridiculous, but Jake's smirk and a pointed jab. Really? Shut her down, the tide turning as an older woman coughed. Maybe we should let this go, Karen. He's not even in the HOA. A crack in her armor that widened when President Richard flipped through the papers and agreed. He's right, we've got no jurisdiction, and if he sues, we're done. That meeting marked Karen's unraveling. Half the board turned on her within a week, some resigning to dodge legal fallout, others apologizing to Jake for the mess. And then came the emergency vote, a text from Linda buzzing his phone late one night. It's happening, they're removing her, followed hours later by she's out. It's over. A coup that saw Karen stripped of her presidency, her house hitting the market the next morning as rumors swirled she'd been pressured to leave by the very neighbors she'd terrorized. Jake didn't need to lift a finger. The town had done it for him, Crestwood's rebels and fed-up residents dismantling her reign without him stepping into the fray. And as her moving truck rolled out, he celebrated quietly on his porch, coffee in hand, roosters crowing, a new sign already ordered to mark his triumph. Word of the feud spread like wildfire, turning Jake versus Karen into local legend. Some HOA diehards still backed her, obsessed with rules and property values, but the neutrals watched it unfold like a reality show, popping corn as Jake's sunflowers and market days clashed with her clipboard tyranny, while unexpected allies emerged from Crestwood's shadows, folks like Linda, who'd baked him a pie and smirked. You're doing God's work. Fed up with fines for chalk drawings and eager to see Karen fall, their quiet support leaking insider dirt that fueled his fight, a community split between her control freaks and his rebels, all while the town beyond laughed at the absurdity of it all. The town couldn't get enough of the Jake and Karen saga, small-town gossip turning it into a full-blown spectacle, a Facebook group exploding with posts cheering Jake on. HOA people are the worst. I'd watch this as a reality show, while Maggie's Cafe leaned in, slinging Karen specials, dry chicken, no flavor, and Jake burgers, loaded and proud, the local paper even running a story with a gem from an anonymous HOA member. I'll take the rooster over 2 more years of Karen, a sentiment that had the diner buzzing as her grip slipped further. Her final Hail Mary came one morning when Jake woke to find every road to his farm lined with "No trespassing," private community signs, the HOA's desperate bid to claim public turf as their own. A move so bold he just stared, shaking his head at her gall, but a few phone calls later, a county official rolled up, livid. Karen had no right to block roads, and by day's end the signs were gone, her slapped with a warning for overreach. A third strike that sealed her fate with the board. Linda's texts lit up his phone that night. They're voting her out. Then she's gone. The emergency meeting a bloodbath as fed-up homeowners, armed with Jake's evidence and their own grudges, ousted her, her house listed for sale by sunrise, the rumor mill whispering she'd been quietly pushed out by the neighbors she'd ruled with an iron fist. A collapse so swift it felt like justice itself had taken the wheel. Karen's downfall wasn't just a moment but a slow, glorious implosion. Richard, the HOA president, had tolerated her until her war on Jake spiraled into legal quicksand. And that packed meeting at the community center saw her loyalists crumble as Greg, the veteran with leaked emails, called her out for wasting funds. Linda piling on with tailies of fake complaints and illegal fencing. Richard sealing it with Jake's cease and desist, warning of lawsuits if they didn't act. Her pleas and threats drowned out by a vote that stripped her bare, leaving her trembling as he handed her the final notice. You're done, sell and go. The next day, her moving truck rumbled off, some saying she'd fled town entirely, and Jake capped it with a custom sign facing Crestwood. Welcome to Mitchell Farms. No HOA, no Karens, no problem. A local hit that drew photos napping visitors, a middle finger to her legacy as peace settled in. The neighborhood unwinding from her reign, yards sprouting personality, kids biking free, no more petty fines or clipboard crusades. Crestwood's new board even sent Jake an apology letter, framed beside Karen's infamous demands on his wall, and Linda led a crew with baked goods one evening, offering a truce. No more fighting, she grinned, pecan pie in hand, Jake smirking. As long as you're not annexing my land, we're good. A laugh sealing years of tension into dust. With Karen gone, his farm thrived. Weekend markets ballooned into town staples, families flocking for eggs and music, even ex-HOA folks joining in, buying from the land she'd tried to erase. While word trickled back that Karen's fresh start elsewhere had backfired, landing her in a new HOA with a tyrant worse than her. Fined for grass height and shut down when she tried to seize power, her new house up for sale in weeks. A poetic twist that had Jake chuckling on his porch, sipping coffee. Glancing at his sign, knowing he'd won the war she'd never had a prayer of finishing. Jake's victory wasn't just a personal win. It rippled through Crestwood Estates and beyond, a tale that turned him into a folk hero of sorts. The stubborn farmer who toppled an HOA tyrant with grit, roosters, and a field of sunflowers, while Karen's exit left a vacuum that felt like a collective exhale. The neighborhood shedding her oppressive rules like a snake slewing off skin, yards blooming with wildflowers, kids scribbling chalk art without fear. Families grilling without fines for unauthorized smoke, a freedom they hadn't tasted in years. His farm, meanwhile, hit its stride. The weekend farmer's fun day morphed into a full-blown market, a Saturday ritual drawing crowds from across town, pickup trucks lining the road as folks scooped up fresh milk, petted goats, and swayed to local fiddlers, the air thick with laughter and the clink of coins, a thriving middle finger to Karen's crusade that even lured some reformed HOA types, their baskets heavy with his eggs, a quiet nod to the irony of buying from the man she'd tried to bury. The new board, desperate to distance itself from her mess, kept their word. No more annexing schemes, just a shaky truce that held as long as Jake's land stayed his. And he was fine with that, content to sip his coffee and watch his roosters strut, the framed apology letter on his wall a trophy of a war well won. But karma wasn't done with Karen. Whispers drifted back that her new life had imploded spectacularly. Her move to another HOA-run town a misstep into a mirror of her old self, where a rival enforcer fined her for every petty infraction. Grass too high, car too close to the curb, shutting down her power grab so fast she was selling again within a month. A delicious twist that had Jake grinning when it hit the diner gossip circuit, proof she'd met her match in a game she'd invented. The town itself couldn't let it go. Jake's sign, "No HOA, no Karen's, no problem," became a landmark, a selfie spot for locals and passers-by, some driving miles just to snap a pic with the farmer who'd faced down suburban tyranny, while Maggie's Cafe kept the Jake Burger on the menu. A hearty staple outselling the Karen special 10-1, the feud now a quirky footnote in local lore, hashed out over coffee and fries. Crestwood's rebels like Linda and Greg stayed in touch, dropping by with pies or just to chat. Their alliance born in battle now a casual friendship, Linda once joking. "We should have teamed up sooner, could have saved us all some gray hairs." And Jake, chuckling, agreed, though he wouldn't trade the fight for anything. It had given him more than just peace, it had given him a story. The HOA itself unraveled without Karen's iron grip, half its members bailing, the rest too sheepish to flex rules after the legal scare Jake's lawyer had dangled, leaving Crestwood a quieter place, its manicured lawns softening into something less rigid, a neighborhood finally learning to live and let live, a phrase Jake had always sworn by. And as spring rolled in, he expanded again. More sunflowers, a new chicken coop, plans for a fall festival. His farm a testament to resilience, not just his own but his ancestors'. A legacy she'd tried to paint over but only made brighter. Every crow at dawn a reminder that he'd stood his ground and won, Karen's shadow long gone, her war lost to a man who'd never wanted it in the first place. With Karen gone and the HOA in shambles, Jake's life settled into a rhythm of triumph and quiet defiance. His farm not just surviving but flourishing, a living rebuke to every clipboard-waving threat she'd hurled his way. The weekend market now a town institution, its tents and music a siren call to families who'd once tiptoed around her rules, their kids chasing chickens while parents swapped cash for his honey and squash, a community hub born from spite that outlasted her reign. Crestwood Estates, too, found its footing. Without her barking orders, the neighborhood softened, lawns growing shaggy, Christmas lights lingering past New Year's, a rebellion of normalcy that felt like a middle finger to her memory. And when the new board sent Jake that apology letter, he hung it beside her cease and desist demand, a matched set of absurdity and atonement he'd show off with a grin to anyone who asked, proof he'd weathered her storm and come out on top. The sign, "Welcome to Mitchell Farms." No HOA, no Karens, no problem. Stood proud, weather-beaten but bold, a tourist draw that had folks posing beside it like it was a monument. Which in a way it was, a marker of the war he'd won not with lawyers or fists, but with roosters, sunflowers, and sheer stubbornness. A legacy that stretched beyond his land to the town itself, where Karen became shorthand for petty tyrants, her name a punchline over diner coffee. And Karma's final laugh echoed back. Her new HOA nightmare, fined into submission by a clone of her old self, had her fleeing again, a poetic end that had Jake chuckling on his porch. The irony as rich as the soil he tilled, her downfall a mirror of the hell she dished out, leaving her a ghost in his story, never to return. Jake didn't rest on his laurels. He doubled down, planting more fields, adding a fall festival with hayrides and pumpkins, his farm a beacon of what Crestwood could have embraced instead of fighting. And the rebels like Linda and Greg became regulars, their visits less about strategy now and more about pie and gossip. A bond forged in battle that held firm in peace, Linda once musing. "You turned her war into our win." And Jake, nodding, knew she was right. The feud a catalyst that freed more than just his land. The town leaned into it. The newspaper ran follow-ups, the Facebook group crowned him Farmer King, and Maggie's kept slinging Jake burgers, a culinary nod to his grit, while Crestwood's ex-HOA crowd trickled in, buying eggs with sheepish smiles, a quiet truce that needed no words, just the cluck of his hens and the rustle of his fields. As seasons turned, he'd sit with his coffee, watching dawn paint the barn red. A red Karen had hated but couldn't touch. His roosters crowing loud enough to wake the dead, or at least the suburbs, and he'd glance at that sign, a smirk tugging his lips, knowing he'd kept his creed. Live and let live, a philosophy she'd never grasped, her loss paving his gain. Mitchell Farms stood taller than ever, HOA-free since 1923, a date he'd tacked on later for kicks. And though Karen had started the fight, Jake finished it, not with anger but with roots deep as his ancestors. A victory sown in dirt and defiance, one she'd never see coming, and as the sun rose over his golden fields, he knew peace, real peace, was his, earned the hard way and sweeter for it.